as we are shifting away from degree requirements or prior qualifications, work trials and some form of skill assessment happening in the interview process is a really great workaround for this. This is a really great way of saying, okay, we don't have the degree to validate that this person can do X, Y, and Z, but we can just test them on this right now and give them the opportunity to show us that this is in their skill set and that they're able to do what we're asking them to do.
Initiating becoming a hiring machine sequence in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, it's Sam Keenley, and welcome back to Becoming a Hiring Machine. This is the show dedicated to fixing recruitment by going beyond saying what needs to change and instead teaches you how to make that change. Today, we have a great trending topics episode ahead of us, but before we get into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about the show. Essentially, we have shows within the show here. Some days we have interviews with industry thought leaders and others who are shaking up the space, while other days we cover things like trending topics. Stop by every Tuesday for a Tactical Tuesday episode where we go deep on how to do something that's going to help you drive better results in your day-to-day. Some days we open up for Q&A. Listeners can drop in questions that they'd like to hear us take on, so send those to us at podcast@loxo.co. And occasionally you'll hear a mic drop episode from Matt where he shares something that he's been thinking about within the recruitment space and wants you to know. All right, today's trending topic. Go scroll through any recruiting community that you're in recently, and you are guaranteed to find a conversation about skills-based hiring. Why you should be doing it, why you shouldn't be doing it, what's it mean for hiring organizations, what's it mean for candidates, what's it mean for recruiters. I'm going to be honest, I love the back and forth of it all because it means that recruiters are really thinking about it and what it could mean for the future of recruitment. It's very much still open for discussion. So today we're bringing in our queen of trending topics, Lex, and she's going to help unpack this trending topic and what I know is going to be a fun conversation. So with that, let's jump in. Lex, welcome back.
Yeah, I am excited to get into this one. Like you said, there's a lot of different opinions on skills-based hiring within the recruitment space. And honestly, I was surprised as I started diving deeper into this topic how hot the takes were on either side. People have really strong opinions. And the thing that I found throughout the process is before diving into this, I would have said I'm very much pro skills based hiring, but I've read some compelling data that's made me question that mentality and try to look for a happy medium. So I think that this will be an interesting conversation, whichever side of the fence you typically fall on. I think that this will challenge you a little bit and will probably provide some interesting data. So I like to kind of start at the beginning, and we've talked and touched lightly on the concept of skills-based hiring on the podcast before, primarily because it relates really highly to this kind of like long-term approach with candidates, viewing them as individuals rather than a list of qualifications on a sheet of paper, like really thinking about the holistic person themselves. And so it ties in very nicely to, the approach that we believe in at Loxo of having this long-term relational approach to recruitment. But I think that it's helpful to look at why the system has been the way that it's been for so long and kind of paint that picture before we start challenging the assumptions of today. So, in the past, this is, the very recent past, employers would use college degrees as one of the number one pieces of evidence when trying to make a good hire. They're a really good filter for what people believe to be, persistence and just kind of grit and will. Finishing your college education is this proof that like you can do it, you can finish something. They were also seen as an indicator of skill and just general capability. But as time has gone on, we started to see this period of like degree inflation where now it's like, okay, pretty much everyone has a degree of some sort. And so the degrees themselves start to mean a little bit less than they used to. And that combined with some of the labor shortages that we were experiencing right before the pandemic started to create this really interesting situation of, okay, there are some tired assumptions here that people who have degrees are in general better workers than those who don't. And we started to see some pushback around that mentality, which I find really interesting. Seeing those trends over time and just the value of a degree itself is really fascinating and something that, I feel like even, when I was faced with the decision of go to college or not go to college, that wasn't even a decision. It was just so obvious. Like you have to go to college to get a job. But now you're starting to see that kind of be called into question a little bit more too. Like, are there training programs that I could get involved in instead of getting a traditional college degree? Are there other ways that I could kind of prove that I have the skill set necessary to do X, Y, or Z job rather than going through the traditional path? So the status quo is starting to shift a bit here, and I find that really interesting. Obviously, COVID changed things even more and threw things into a tailspin when it came to hiring. So we're still dealing with the after effects of that as well, even as the labor market has shifted now to being a little bit more, on the employer side rather than on the shortages side. We're starting to see this conversation become a lot more prevalent. We're also starting to see that people have started instituting this kind of skills based hiring mentality. So there's more data now around the success rates than we had 5 years ago when this was just starting to become a conversation. So basically, all of that to say, the past has gotten us to where we are today. There are some lessons that we've learned throughout history around hiring and like really assessing a candidate in general. And the skills based hiring movement has gained quite a bit of momentum in the past 5 to 10 years. And more employees are starting to get really bought in on this idea. But companies themselves, it's a little bit harder and slower of a process. So we're kind of in this weird middle ground right now, I would say.
Everyone's feeling it out, trying to figure out like, what does this mean for me as an employer? What does this mean for me as a candidate? Yeah, it is an interesting one. Just with when you think about why college degrees were a requirement when they first got started, it was because it was not as many people had them at the time. So that was, a great way. And also there were more in the knowledge space. You needed certain degrees to say like I'm a certified accountant. You have to have that accounting degree. You're in finance, especially doctors. I'd hope that they'd have a medical degree. But as more and more jobs do open up, like, B2B tech companies, software, that wasn't a big space at all before. Like you can have someone who has a communications degree next to someone who has a sociology degree next to someone who has a biology degree. It doesn't matter. So that's why I think people are starting to question like, you know, what's what were we trying to accomplish with saying we want someone who has a degree versus what makes people successful in the role, and how do we vet for more of that instead?
Totally. I feel like I'm a perfect case of this. I studied journalism in school, graduated with a journalism degree. I never became a journalist. I went right into communications and then into marketing. And I make the joke there's the journalist to marketing pipeline is very strong. There are so many of us, and it makes sense. But what ends up happening is whether they realize it or not, a lot of companies are using skills based hiring methods because they're not really hiring based off of the actual specific degree itself, but just on the binary of yes or no, they have one. And so it's
Mhm.
interesting because, yes, my journalism degree can tell an employer something about me and about the skills that I might have. And so they would maybe make a hire for a marketing role, even though I didn't have that marketing experience from my degree. So I think that's an interesting kind of flip side way of looking at this. You've probably already been using a little bit of a skills based hiring mentality, whether you
Mhm.
realized it or not. And so I think that that's kind of a way of subtly shifting that perspective around it so that it doesn't feel like it's this drastic change, but rather something that you've kind of been walking toward for a while slowly.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you put it that way because Matt has talked about what he calls pattern matching within recruitment. And so that's that type of thing where journalists make great marketers, copywriters specifically, but no one goes to school and gets a copywriting. Like that doesn't exist, like B2B copywriting. But what's that higher level? Like, what do they learn? What's the skill that they are acquiring there? And so, yeah, that pattern matching, I think it wasn't called skills based hiring before. It was just like, oh, Lex went to school for journalism. I bet she's a really good writer, and we could use her on our team for PR, for comms, for copywriting. So yeah, I think it's just the coining of the phrase that's starting to throw people for a bit more of a loop than they used to.
100%. That, and then also just the challenging around the mentality of does someone need a degree or not? And what
Mm,
does a degree say about a person? I think that we, again, on that kind of implicit bias level, subconsciously think of people who have degrees as more skilled in a general sense than someone who does not have a degree. And so I think that our assumptions around that school of thought or what kind of need to shift a little bit, or maybe they don't. This is where things start to get a little bit confusing. I think it does depend so much on the role, it depends so much on the industry. Like you said, there are so many people who are very talented and skilled in certain areas that you can't really get a degree for anyway. And so if as an 18-year-old who's about to, enter into school or some form of training that you want to be this niche job and there's not a degree for it, maybe you just start pursuing, experiential skill development rather than getting a degree just to say that you have one. So I think that the new generation of, schoolgoers are starting to push back against this mentality a little bit themselves and just say, okay, for the path that I'm on right now, do I need a degree or not? And like, should I pursue this or should I spend my time elsewhere? And it doesn't mean that they're not driven or that they're not motivated. It just means that they're thinking a little bit more critically about the path before them, which I would argue is maybe a good skill to take into consideration.
Yeah, and before we completely rabbit hole down the education conversation, yeah, it's like, well, one, go back a couple generations. You could only learn advanced learning through university, through college. Now go to YouTube, go to like Harvard Business School has online courses, go to Coursera. There's so many places where you can learn and get that type of advanced knowledge that weren't accessible before. So that's where it's like, well, do I need that certification that says, yeah, I graduated from XYZ university, or can I go take a course that is the same exact thing but it's online instead? So there's that element of it that I think, I don't know, that's a big part of the equation, that it's a variable, it's changed it, and
For
that's
sure.
what is needs to be taken into account with this. So all right, don't want to rabbit hole us on education. Let's
Yeah.
get into like the next big part of this.
Yeah. So the next big thing is just kind of okay, skills based hiring is one of those things that I think we can all agree sounds good in theory, but is this something that can actually work in practice? And, does this actually lead to an increase in access for more workers to jobs that they are qualified for? So, this is an interesting takeaway that I had from a study that I read from Harvard Business School. They said, for all its fanfare, the increased opportunity promised by skills based hiring played itself out in only 1 in 700 hires last year. So while this conversation has been gaining quite a bit of momentum, it hasn't actually translated to that big of a change in terms of organizations actually instituting this mentality or methodology into their hiring practices. So I think like they broke it down by saying new opportunities were created for only approximately 97,000 out of 77 million annual hires. So 97,000 sounds pretty great until you put it next to that 77 million. So I don't know. I think this is an interesting one. It's not entirely surprising given how new this conversation is and how, from an admin perspective, there are a couple of things to sort through before being able to fully institute a practice like this. So I think this is, surprising on some level, but also not entirely, and also not necessarily discouraging, even if you are someone who is a proponent of skills based hiring. Um, yeah. Any thoughts on this stat? I was kind of unpacking this last night and I was like, do I
Hmm.
feel surprised by this or not? I don't know. I can't really tell.
Yeah, so where my data brain immediately goes to on this is, are how is this being categorized? Like, are these companies that are checking a box and saying I'm only hiring based on skills based hiring, or like how are they reflecting back to identify this? Do you know?
So I don't remember that piece of information specifically. What I do remember, though, that I found was really interesting is there were a certain subset of organizations that way higher accounted for this group of 97,000 opportunities. So within certain organizations, specifically nonprofits, that was a really big one. There is more of this mentality around skills based hiring, and that kind of carries a lot of these statistics and,
Hmm.
shifts them in that direction. So that was one of the interesting takeaways. I can pull and I'll drop it into the show notes how exactly they polled this group of people because I am curious about that as well. And I'm sure that I can find that with some
Yeah, 'cause
digging
that's
in the
what's like, if
study.
they're pulling it from, ATS data or something, if it's a box, like does that box even exist for 99% of those
Totally.
other ones, or again the self-identification. So because we both, as you were saying earlier, like people are intuitively doing some of this, but yeah, I mean that number in and of itself, even if there are more people doing it, instead of 1 out of 700 hires, 1 out of 500 hires, it's still a lot of ground to be made up there.
Totally. So I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is just this is something that requires more than just like stripping language from a job posting. In order to fully hire for skill, you need to implement very intentional changes across your hiring practices. And that change is really difficult. And it's really easy for that to be deprioritized, especially given the fact that, again, the data is unclear around this right now. The people who are instituting these like skills based hiring methodologies in a really intentional way are kind of pioneers at this stage because it is not commonplace and it's still a very new and relatively unproven methodology. So I think that that's an interesting tension that people who are considering moving in this direction have to weigh is, okay, this is not necessarily proven. I'm taking a bit of a gamble. And that's why I think if you're going to do it, it has to be very candidate led, and it has to really hinge on having an excellent talent acquisition team, recruiters that you can really trust to be able to make these decisions in that kind of like strategic mindset way, rather than simply saying, okay, we're opening the floodgates, anyone can come in and take this job. You really need to weigh almost that like qualitative side of things. And that's
Hmm.
tricky, really tricky.
Yeah, and that's where my mind immediately goes to is, do you have to signal this to the market beforehand that like, hey, our approach, our philosophy to hiring is much more related around skills that you have and have acquired. So what would that mean for the candidate? Because traditional resume is job one, this company, job two, this company, a couple bullet points in between. But if it's skills based, if you're applying for a senior account executive role somewhere, and you're currently just a normal account executive, you're going to really want to build up like, I've had this job title before, I've worked in, software companies or anything else. But now it could be someone's going for a sales job. It's like, well, I didn't have an account executive job before, but I sold this in college. Started a company doing this and that. So I think it's going to completely change also what the candidate would put forward for that application process, because it is going to change the current way, so to speak, that so many people are used to, because it's based more on like, what's your job experience looked like versus what's the skill set that you have.
Yeah. And I think it kind of exacerbates the problem a little bit in the sense of unqualified candidates applying and kind of weighing down that stage of the process. There's a lot of kind of, people who just aren't a very good fit. And as soon as you open the doors to saying, hey, we don't really have these strict requirements anymore, we're hiring based off of skill and, past experience. And that can mean a whole lot of different things. You're going to start getting people who are like, oh, yeah, I could do this job. Yeah, I'll apply. And again, this is where having that more proactive approach to recruitment comes into the mix, and it's more about, okay, building relationships and understanding the skill sets of candidates who are in your database and being able to reach out to them rather than having a bunch of clutter come through and having to sift through that, because that is one of the first pushback points that I kind of see when it comes to instituting skills-based hiring far and wide is it makes the early stages of the hiring process a lot clunkier and a little bit more difficult to sift through. It's going to be much more time intensive, and there's some problems that could come from that for sure.
So where my mind immediately went to as you were saying that, I think this might apply more to like passive and outbound recruiting than to inbound. You don't change that process up and open the floodgates. Like, I sold Girl Scout cookie once. I can be your sales rep, but more, as we were talking about earlier, like that pattern recognition where you can spot those and see how they translate. We've had the previous episodes where it's like people that were in the military, the skills that they gain, and then they can apply to civilian type roles. So maybe this is more weighted on that side for the recruiter who's going out to passively find the next great candidate and opening that up, versus opening the floodgates, so to speak, for some of those people that are like, ambitious, thank you, but not quite it today.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think that is an interesting, just a moment to take another disclaimer and say, like, this obviously only works in certain industries as well and for certain roles. So having that mentality around this is not going to work for everyone. And we would never claim that that's the case, because skills based hiring in general, I think you are looking at a specific subset of roles. It's something that, yeah, there are, like you said, doctors, nurses, any like technical profession in some sense, there are binary systems that we can use to kind of weed out a lot of fluff. But I think in this case, yeah, it's definitely a case for having that more proactive mentality of outbound recruitment rather than waiting for people to come in and apply to the job themselves. So the next kind of thing that I want to get into is just some of the encouraging signals that have been seen around skills based hiring. Again, there is limited data here because this is still so new, but there is some interesting analysis that came from the Harvard Business School study that basically says that when it is embraced, skills based hiring goes beyond corporate virtue signaling and actually does yield tangible, measurable results. So they kind of categorize it as a potential win-win for both companies and for employees or prospective employees themselves. So one way that I like to think about this, and we've talked about this concept quite a bit, is just the idea of learning programs and internal mobility for, candidates or for employees that you already have. And I think that companies that are instituting a skills-based hiring methodology are also more likely to be instituting some kind of internal mobility framework that encourages skill development and encourages like the growth of an employee. So one thing that has been tied again loosely because the data is still so new is around the idea of retention rates surrounding skills-based hires. So non-degreed workers who do get a job at a skills-based hiring firm are more likely to stay at that firm. So they said that it has a 10% increase in retention rate to their degree holder colleagues, which I found really interesting. So
Hmm.
on some level, I think it's like, okay, when you take the gamble on this employee, they feel that and are appreciative of it, and they want to grow at the company that has hired them. So I thought that was an interesting data point for sure.
I don't know why I always do this. I always go and play devil's advocate. I think because we like to have
Do it.
like weigh both sides of the equation, right?
Yeah.
And really see like, okay, where did people come from? So yes, 10%. They appreciate that they took a gamble on them. They took them like, hey, I want to stick around, be here for a while. The thought that creeped into my head on this is also, did they think like, I know how hard it is to get a job with my lack of experience, my lack of college degree. So they stick around more so because they know it's that much harder to just like get into the interview process somewhere else to get that role. So again, like I don't know the answer. I always like to try to think of like what are all the possible
Yeah.
discussion points and just put them out on the table. Just like we don't know the answer, but it's like it's really interesting when we see these different data points and what the different stories could be with them.
Yeah, another one that comes to mind as you say that is okay, potentially these employees in general are just not in as high of demand. So they're getting less recruiters reaching out to them about other opportunities. They're getting less interest externally when it comes to
Hmm.
things that would pull them away. And so there is a little bit of that. Yeah, maybe they're staying simply because this is the best option they have at the time. Or maybe it is truly born out of some sense of loyalty of, hey, this person went out on a limb for me. I'm sticking around. I'm going to keep growing here. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, definitely it's fun to challenge that and flip it on its head. And that's why I think it is so important to have that story and curious mentality when it comes to any piece of data because there are multiple ways of unpacking this every single time. So I think that that's a really good call out. Anyway, one of the biggest things, and I already touched on this, but they did say that companies who do hire based on skills are also more likely to invest in upskilling their employees, and that has been proven to reduce attrition rates as
Hmm.
well. When you have an internal mobility program in place, employees want to know what their growth plan looks like at a company, or else they're more likely to be wooed away by another who can offer them that. So I love to think about this in marketing terms. We always say it takes way less money to retain an existing customer than it does to acquire a new one. And so I think the same mentality applies here. When you
Hmm.
have this kind of long term approach to your employees and are willing to invest in them and keep them happy and keep them motivated, that is a lot easier and a lot cheaper than hiring someone new. And it's also a lot less risky. You know the skills that you have in front of you, and you're able to provide the tools and the paths necessary to upskill this person if they are weak in certain areas. So, the other piece of the puzzle, obviously, is we've seen that this can be beneficial for companies in terms of hiring, but also retention. For workers, I think that the pros are a little bit more obvious here. Non degreed workers are getting more opportunity. One of the biggest things that has been used as a pro for the argument of skills based hiring is equality and equity in the workplace in general. Those who do have degrees are generally in more of a place of privilege in general. And so this kind of helps balance the scales a little bit of giving more opportunities to people who may not have had the same level of economic opportunity when it came to like pursuing a degree or not. And so there is a little bit of that mentality of, okay, we're opening up more opportunities to more people who may be just as hungry and ready and capable to do this job, but don't have the on paper skills necessary previously for the role. And then also, as we open the door to this kind of long term approach around an individual, we're opening the door for more upskilling as their career goes on. And obviously, that's beneficial to the individual as well. So I think it's
Hmm.
very easy to see the pros for the employees in this. The question and where it gets really complicated is more on the company side, which makes sense.
Yeah, and one other one on the workers that I'm thinking of when I think you and I've probably seen the same different studies coming across, but especially it's like millennials, Gen Z, they want to work at a place where they're connected, where they feel tied to the value, like the mission, what the company's doing. And what I think this also does for workers is it gives you the ability to more easily transition across different job roles, different industries if you have the skills, but it's not as cut and dry. It's like you've only worked in financial services before, you have to stay in financial services. But like, what did you learn in that role that you can apply to nonprofit, that you can apply to, insert any other industry? So I think that's an interesting one to think about from the worker side of it. Is it does open up other paths that previously were really hard to jump across.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, yeah, like that lateral mobility on some sense is more of an option now
Hmm.
if you have this skills based mentality where it's like, okay, we know you and we believe in you. And if you say that you want to do this, like we've seen what you can do here, why don't we try it out over here? And so within an organization and then also externally, I feel like if we have more of that mindset, yeah, that is such a good point.
Yeah. And so translate that over to the recruiter. Don't get so niched down that you think, as part of your Boolean, you have to plug in like financial services, SaaS, something else. You can open it up and be a little bit broader and look at like, what did they accomplish at this place? And then think about, okay, how do I connect the dots to understand, could that translate for this really hard to fill position that I'm working on? So food for thought.
Exactly. It goes back to that mentality that we've talked about before. What is a Bigfoot candidate, a purple squirrel, whatever
Yep.
you want to call it? What is that person? Who are they? What skills do they have? And how do you search for them? This is kind of opening those doors a little bit, which is helpful in some ways and hard in others because it does force you to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more critical throughout the process.
Hmm.
So this leads really nicely into the next piece. And I think one of the things that is the most complicated about this whole mentality, which is okay, even if this is a really great idea, how do we operationalize it? And should we? Those are kind of the two natural questions that come here. Basically, I think one of the reasons why this is such a hot topic is AI has really changed the game. And, you brought this up earlier, and I'm not going to rabbit hole down the education mindset, but I think, educational institutions are very big. There's a lot of red tape. And so, as these new fields of study are coming into the picture, educational systems are not really able to support those new disciplines. And I think that that has become and created like a really interesting dilemma where, one of the most growing fields right now in the US is AI prompting. There's no class for that or no degree for it. A couple of universities have started creating like support programs for that
Hmm.
specifically, but there isn't a degree in AI prompting that you can get. But if someone were to have that skill set today, they'd be invaluable to an organization. So I think that as these technological advancements start to happen more frequently and the educational system just is not built to be as agile, we're starting to run into this problem where okay, maybe today we're having this debate and this conversation, but in 10 years' time, we might need to think about this when it comes to how we hire and how we structure our organizations. So I think that that's one interesting piece of the puzzle about where we are right now is okay, we're still in kind of this philosophical mindset, but
Hmm.
we can't stay here for very long because this issue is becoming more and more of a factor as we continue to progress. So I think that's
Yeah.
an interesting part of it for me.
It really is. It's just like the speed at which innovation is occurring now is so much faster. And I forget, I had seen another study on this, but yeah, like the curve has really starting to come up on that exponential growth side. And that's where the degrees, yeah, prompt engineering, that doesn't exist in any school. Go to YouTube though. Guarantee you there's tens of thousands of video on it. And so again, you're trying to learn the skill, it's like in my head, I think we're going more towards the rise of I'll call it like the figure it out ability worker. So the individual who can go to Google to answer your question. Use Chat GPT effectively. YouTube is bookmarked. Like they're always going there. Like I need to do this. Like how do I do it? And doing some of that. So that I think is going to be an interesting part where it's like they have those skills, but how do you vet for that? How do you operationalize? Like that's where, yeah, as you say, I think that's the part where it's just like we're in between theory to practice right now, and we're trying to figure out what does this look like in practice.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different opinions on how this can work. And again, a lot of different things to consider. One of the biggest pieces of pushback, and this makes so much sense, is just around the level of structural reorganization that would have to take place to
Hmm.
support this in the long term. Basically, you'd have to change how you pay, how you hire, how you train. All of that is so much easier said than done. And even to the point of internal mobility and lateral moves within a company, there becomes the question of like, okay, how much do employees really even want that? And then how much does it benefit the company itself? And so having to think through that really critically, again, we're kind of tugged between the human side of things that wants to look at things very individually, and there's so much good in that, but then there's also the very real, you know, productivity that has to be maintained, and the efficiency side of things where it's like, okay, we've got this structure, how do we change it fundamentally without really like losing something along the way?
Hmm. Yeah, this one's gonna be tough. Um, I'm already taking notes on this part. And I think where it's coming down to it is it's like that subjectivity of it. And I think that's what the degrees really spoke to before is if someone had a degree in marketing, they've got these certain skills. They had to take a business management class, they had to take an accounting class, they had to take marketing 101, 102, all those different things. So that they at least have those fundamental skills in their back pocket. So it's easy to say, we're hiring for this role. The typical candidate should have this type of experience, and it level sets them. And then from the pay standpoint, okay, we know this is kind of like what market value is on them. Transition over to the skill side. I have skills in marketing. Well, that now is a lot more subjective in terms of, well, what kind of skills, like how deep, what do you know, what don't you know, how well do you know it, how well can you execute it. And so that's where I think it becomes a lot more tricky, as you were saying, like the how they pay and how they train. I'm just like, ooh, this is completely changing the game, because it's not people, everyone's kind of starting at that same spot, but there's a much broader spectrum of where people are coming in from.
Oh yeah. And I think that that's the really, you mentioned subjectivity. I think that's the really funny thing about this is on paper, I think people would say that skills-based hiring reduces biases, but on the flip side, it can also increase them in some sense as well. There are legitimate concerns that this could end up actually creating an opportunity for there to be more biases, because as you become more subjective in how and who you're hiring,
Hmm.
you're also creating room for an individual to decide what another individual is worth, and that can become dicey very quickly. And so I think that that's an interesting thing to consider is, okay, on paper we're saying this will reduce bias and it will increase opportunity for more people, but is that actually true? Can we trust ourselves to do that? Is a big part of
Yeah.
the question as well.
And my mind immediately went to yes, but then it also goes to, well, what about the current process? Because there's still that there. Because I was thinking about, go look at the financial sector, stock traders in New York, and my mind immediately goes to, they all hire from Ivy League schools, right? Well, why isn't the person from Iowa State with their finance degree? Why wouldn't you hire them? It's the same degree, right?
Mm,
So that's where I draw that same line again, where it's like, okay, well, is it because that the curriculum is so much harder at the Ivy League school? Well, how does that then translate again over to this kind of thing? So before we go on get on saying like it's going to reduce bias, it's going to increase bias, go look at our current process. It's not perfect either. So yeah, I don't know. It's again, that's a hard one. Just putting out more discussion points on the table.
100%. And I think that, again, this raises a really interesting question of just how can you measure bias? How can you create a system out of something that is inherently subjective? And then also, just how can you holistically assess a candidate? It's a really difficult thing to do, and especially to operationalize. On an individual level, I think we can all do that, but how do you institute a policy or a framework around that? Well, that becomes a whole different conversation. And I think that that's where, companies struggle with this. And I can see why it is so difficult is, okay, in theory, we understand this, but in practice, it just starts to break down a little bit. And I think I go back to that point, what you just said ties into this. We're already doing this on some level. There's already this skills based assessment that's happening often in the interview process. Two candidates could be equally qualified on paper, but one nudges the other out because there's just some sense of who that person is and how they could fit better at the company. And so I think it's important to remember that there already is precedent set for this methodology. It's more so around how much, like to what extent should we operationalize it, and to what extent should we almost enforce it, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah. So how do we work around this? Like, what do we do?
So I was trying to think about this in terms of like, how could you incorporate more of this methodology and this mentality into your hiring practice without those major structural reorganizations and
Hmm.
kind of like shifting everything as you know it? And a couple of the things that came to mind are just, one, having a more flexible approach around degrees and the requirements around them. I think, again, this is already something that we've started to see shifting, but this is a great thing, yeah, to put in a job description and then to tell, as hiring managers, to tell your recruiters, like, hey, ideally, this person would have one of these 10 degrees, but we're open if there are other qualifications that make it clear that this person could be successful in this role. So I think having that, like, widening the lens a little bit around
Hmm.
degrees themselves is something that I think makes sense today, and especially in 10 years' time will be almost necessary, just given the way that we're going.
So one thing I really like about that, where my mind goes, yeah, most job descriptions, it's like must have college degree and must have 3 years experience. And this is Boolean, right? So change the and to the or. That's kind of what I think about from the recruiter's perspective is must have college degree or must have 5 years experience selling.
Yeah,
I mean, that could be, I don't know, just kind of like that one small word change, but that could change that entire process of how you go and find those people.
100%. And I think it addresses that whole issue that candidates feel a lot of the time, which is like, you need X amount of experience. And it's like, well, how do I get that experience if no one's willing to take a chance on me and give
Yeah.
me the experience? And I think that this helps, yeah, kind of have that framework in place of, okay, you might have experience in other ways. You haven't gotten this degree yet, or you don't have this exact qualification, but like we can work around that. And I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about it. The other thing that comes to mind, and we just recently did an episode on this, is work trials. I think that this is, again, a highly contested piece of the hiring slash interview process puzzle. But I think that as we are shifting away from degree requirements or prior qualifications, work trials and some form of skill assessment happening in the interview process is a really great workaround for this if both the hiring team and the candidate are willing to participate and engage in something like that. This is a really great way of saying, okay, we don't have the degree to validate that this person can do X, Y, and Z, but we can just test them on this right now and give them the opportunity to show us that this is in their skill set and that they're able to do what we're asking them to do.
Yeah. I mean, my mind immediately goes to that example you were talking about the other week with there's like the multimedia marketer, someone where she was like, I don't have the video editing skills, but they're not going to ask for that. She gets thrown in, and of course they say like make a video out of this, and she stumbled. But yeah, there's so many different sides where you can do that. One, if you have people coming in from skills based, I'm good with the video. Put them through practice. Are they just showing you stuff that they shot on their iPhone with all stumbly around, like they hit the record button and that was it? Or you have people in this world like Casey Neistat, who is one of like the most creative videographers you'll ever find. He didn't go to college. He didn't have a lot of money to come up with, but I would hire him in a heartbeat if he was open to it. So again, it's like that's where if you go and see like share your portfolio, show me some examples, or just spin up a quick 10-second video for us. I don't know the answer to it, but like having that, I think honestly makes it easier for the people who might not have all of the degrees or all of the perfect experience, but there are so many young, hungry up and comers or people that want to transition from taking a hobby. They don't, that's not on their resume from like this, but they did 15 years of photography before that. Now they want to get into the corporate space for it. Like, I bet they're really good at it. You just have to give them the chance to show it and prove it and see it. So I'm a big fan. If I think work trials become a lot more valuable if this is the route you want to take and going more of the skills based hiring, because that's the ultimate measuring stick of if you're getting rid of the degree, the certification, that's the new bar and what you're setting it at.
Exactly. Because I think we can all agree there needs to be some form of assurance when you're making a hire that this person is going to be able to perform. And it's, you can't afford to make a bad hiring decision. And so I understand the level of perceived risk around moving away from a structure that people think works. I think that, again, we have to challenge the system as it is and then challenge also the proposed alternative. And I think that we can find flaws in both. So I think a healthy workaround in this case is saying, yes, portfolio driven hiring or work trials, any sort of skills assessment built into the hiring process, I think can help kind of put some of those fears to
Hmm.
rest. And then the last one, which I think is something, again, that we've already touched on, this happens already, but moving more towards this referral based, relationship based hiring method, I think could be really interesting to explore more in terms of how do we operationalize that. I mean, I'll speak for myself. Every single job that I've had throughout my entire career has come through working really hard at the job that I'm at and meeting the right person that then introduces me to the next role. There is that level of, okay, it's a relational mentality. It's almost this referral driven approach. And so I know I'm not alone in that. I've spoken to countless colleagues who have a very similar career trajectory. And so I think this becomes an interesting question of, okay, vouching for a person and for what they can bring to the table, even if their past experience may or may not speak to that, is an interesting way of approaching this. And I think from a recruiter's perspective, this involves developing really strong relationships with candidates, but also really trustworthy relationships with hiring teams, making
Hmm.
sure that there is that trust inherently built in. This is where we get into that talent advisor mentality is, okay, does the hiring team trust me to have that really strong instinct about whether or not this candidate makes sense to present to them? And if I am presenting it to them, it means that I think that they could be really successful in this role, whether their resume speaks to that or not.
Yeah, and I think where that becomes so impactful is, when you were saying that you've gotten positions off of this, a bunch of people have, through who you know and everything. I think part of it is one, they know your skill set, but they also know your intangibles, and that's what's so hard to do. And that's why I think people will vouch you because it's like, oh, Lex kills it in what she does, and I also know how well she works, how hard she works, how well she gets along with different teams. So that's a huge, huge piece to it. And then when you start talking about how do recruiters leverage this, it immediately made me think they often find like it's you can find someone great on paper, but it's really hard to know their intangibles sometimes. You can pattern match and everything else, but the more you get to know them, the more that, like, once you see them, how they're placed, the feedback you get from that hiring organization, you should start to find like a handful of couple gold stars in there where it's just like they're like, this person is amazing. They're so good at what they do. The team loves them. They've already done XYZ here. That's an A player, right? Like, we'd probably feel comfortable saying that like that is the exact type of person. And so what I would say is then go tap into that network too of that person, because I guarantee you it's like that old saying, like A players hire A players, B players hire C players. So if you can stay in that A player circle and then just expand from each of those that you get, that is a massively untapped network that you should be probably thinking about. How do you add that into your CRM? How do you start to develop those relationships?
I love, love, love that you brought this up because I had a conversation with one of our customers recently, and she was basically talking about how she builds this into her approach. A lot of the people that you reach out to when you are having this outbound mentality, they might not be interested in talking about a position right now. They might not, certain things, boxes might not be checked, but they probably know someone. And by you reaching out to them and saying, hey, totally understand that this isn't the right opportunity for you, but does anyone come to mind in your network or people that you've worked with in the
Mhm.
past? You're giving them the opportunity to, one, present someone to you that you already have some form of soft understanding around the skill level that they might
Mhm.
have. And then you also are giving that person the opportunity to give their friend an opportunity or their colleague or whoever it may be. And that builds a level of trust between you and that candidate as well, in both directions. So I think that that's a really interesting way of thinking about it is, okay, A players know and associate with A players. And how can you leverage the fact that, yeah, you've built a database of A players. They might not all be the right fit for this job, but they probably know someone who'd be good to talk to.
Mhm. Yeah, if they're willing to stake their reputation on it, I'd hope so.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Oh, that was a lot. That was fun.
I love this topic. And ultimately, this is one that I'm really curious to see what listeners have to say about because I think
Mhm.
that, again, my mind isn't really made up on this topic. I've done a lot of research and there's more to come. This is, again, a very new and shifting, especially in the data regard topic. And so I'm curious to hear hot takes on either side, people who are fans, people who have healthy objections to this methodology. And yeah, please share them with us because I'd love to continue researching, learning, and revisiting this topic over the next couple of months and years.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes because I think, yeah, a lot of people, a lot of insights are going to come out from finally getting this into practice. Does it work? Doesn't not work? There haven't been a lot of big philosophical changes in this space. So this is one that I see. It's not massive, but it's enough to be like, ooh, this is a new approach that we haven't really taken yet. Could it be more effective or is it more ineffective than what we used to do? I don't know, but I guess we'll
Exactly.
stay tuned. I love it. Well, Lex, thank you as always for bringing such a good trending topic to discuss, and that's what I love about these. It's like we don't know the answer. We want to open it up, explore all the different sides, angles. Pick it up, look underneath. Is it ugly? Is it messy? Is it pretty? Who knows? We'll find out. So, hopefully, some recruiters start thinking more about this, incorporating their day to day, and share what they find and their experiences with it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Love this one.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, as we wrap, Becoming a Hire Machine is a production of Loxo. If you really like this episode and you're not sure where to go next, we've got a link to a similar one in the show notes. And you can find those in the description of your favorite podcast streaming platform, as well as on our website, loxo.co/podcasts. If you ever have questions, looking for advice, want to share your experience with skills based hiring, send that to us, podcast@loxo.co. All right, everyone, that's the show. That was an incredible trending topics episode with Lex. Until next time, bye, y'all.